The Focke-Wulf's Brahmo 14-cylinder engine coughed twice, caught, and belched a ring of blue-black exhaust across the grass. A Luftwaffe mechanic, Feldwebel rank, oil-stained coveralls, standing maybe 40 meters from the aircraft's nose, watched an American in a leather A2 jacket settle into the cockpit of his FW-190. Not a test pilot, not an intelligence officer with a briefing folder and 6 weeks of ground school. A fighter pilot who had parked a P-38 Lightning on the opposite end of the strip less than 20 minutes earlier, walked across open ground like he owned the field, and started asking questions about the German throttle quadrant through a mix of broken phrases and hand signals. The mechanic did not shoot him. Nobody shot him. The field had already been overrun, or more precisely, abandoned in a hurry as American armored columns punched through the surrounding roads, and the skeleton ground crew left behind had neither orders nor inclination to die for an airstrip that the Wehrmacht had already written off. What they had, sitting in a revetment with a quarter tank of fuel and functioning landing gear, was a late-model FW-190A8. And now, an American sat in it, running his fingers across labeled switches he could not read, hunting for the fuel mixture lever. The FW-190's cockpit bore zero resemblance to a Lightning's, twin engine versus single, counterclockwise throttle movement versus clockwise, a landing gear system that operated on a completely different mechanical logic. The instrument placards read in German abbreviations that even some Luftwaffe replacement pilots found confusing. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland noted in post-war debriefs that transitioning German pilots needed a minimum of 15 to 20 hours of supervised cockpit familiarization before their first solo flight in the 190. 15 to 20 hours, with instructors, with translated manuals, with a training syllabus built by the people who designed the aircraft. This American had none of that. He had about 12 minutes of pointing at things and watching a captured mechanic nod or shake his head. If this is the kind of story that keeps you coming back to this channel, do me a favor. Hit like, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments what other insane war stories you want me to dig into next. That's what keeps these scripts coming. The rest of this script answers one question. How does a 23-year-old American fighter pilot, trained exclusively on American aircraft, with no formal intelligence background, no German language skills worth mentioning, climb into one of the Luftwaffe's frontline fighters and fly it home? The answer cuts deeper than one cowboy moment on a German airstrip. It reaches back into how American pilots trained, what they understood about enemy aircraft that most Allied pilots never bothered to learn. A culture inside certain fighter groups that actively encouraged exactly this kind of calculated recklessness, and one specific detail about the FW-190's cockpit layout that made the whole thing barely possible. But to understand why it worked, we have to go back to the training pipeline that produced this pilot, and the specific technical knowledge he carried in his head before he ever touched German soil. First, the aircraft itself. The FW-190A8 packed a BMW 801D2 radial engine, generating somewhere around 1,700 horsepower at emergency power, wingspan of 34 feet 5 inches, maximum speed at altitude, roughly 408 miles per hour. It rolled faster than anything the Americans flew in the European theater, a full 360-degree aileron roll in under a second at cruise speed. Luftwaffe pilots loved it for that snap responsiveness. Allied pilots feared it for the same reason. The 190 could reverse a turn and be on your tail before your brain registered the wing flash. But responsiveness cuts both ways. A twitchy aircraft is an unforgiving aircraft, especially on takeoff. Torque from that massive radial wanted to swing the nose left on the ground roll, miss the rudder correction by half a second, and the 190 would ground loop, snap a landing gear strut, and cartwheel into whatever sat at the edge of the runway. Luftwaffe training records from 1943 show a non-trivial percentage of 190 losses came from exactly that scenario. Student pilots who couldn't handle the torque on their first few unassisted takeoffs. The American rolling down that grass strip had never felt that torque before. He had never heard that engine at full power from inside that cockpit. The BMW Radial produced a completely different sound signature than the paired Allisons in his Lightning, deeper, rougher, with a vibration pattern that transmitted through the seat and rudder pedals in ways his muscle memory couldn't predict. Every instinct he'd built over hundreds of hours in the P-38 told him one thing. The aircraft underneath him did another, and he opened the throttle anyway. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, spring of 1945. Inside a secure hangar on the south end of the complex, a captured Messerschmitt Me-262 sat with its engine cowlings removed, both Jumo 004 axial flow turbojets exposed like dissected organs on a laboratory table. American engineers from the Air Technical Service Command had already cataloged over 300 individual components, photographed each one, and begun reverse engineering the turbine blade metallurgy. Down the hall, crates of Luftwaffe gunsight optics waited for inspection. In a separate building, a team worked through stacks of German wind tunnel data shipped from a captured research facility near Braunschweig. The shooting had not stopped yet. The paperwork had already started. This mattered because Washington had made a decision, quietly, deliberately, months before the final collapse, that the endgame in Europe involved something beyond unconditional surrender. The Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, known as CIOS, began coordinating Anglo-American scientific intelligence teams as early as late 1944. Their mandate read like a shopping list for the next century: jet propulsion, rocket guidance, synthetic fuels, advanced metallurgy, chemical weapons research, submarine design, communications encryption. Every category represented a German technical achievement that American planners wanted in American hands before the Soviets, the French, or simple chaos got to it first. The CIOS directive from November 1944 lists over 1,500 specific intelligence targets spread across Western Germany, each one tagged with a priority rating and an assigned exploitation team. 1,500 targets. The war still had 6 months to run, and the United States already had a retrieval plan organized by Grid Square. That instinct, grab the knowledge, not just the ground, explains why a fighter pilot on a captured airstrip felt comfortable climbing into a German cockpit. He operated inside a military culture that treated enemy technology as a resource to be seized, studied, and surpassed. Nobody admired it from a distance or feared it as exotic. Captured equipment flowed back through a system designed to absorb it. Wright Field's Foreign Equipment Branch processed a staggering volume of Axis hardware between 1942 and 1945. Complete airframes, partial assemblies, instruments ripped from wrecks, manuals pulled from dead pilots' map cases. The file index for captured Luftwaffe material at the National Archives runs to multiple volumes. Each entry represents something an American got his hands on in the field and shipped home. So when that P-38 pilot looked at a parked FW-190 and saw an opportunity rather than a mystery, he reflected something institutional. The Army Air Forces published technical intelligence supplements, classified bulletins distributed to operational units that included cockpit diagrams of enemy fighters, throttle positions, landing gear mechanisms, fuel system schematics. The supplements for the FW-190 specifically noted the counterclockwise throttle movement and the location of the Kommandogerät, the automated engine management device that simplified power settings by combining several functions into a single lever. This is where it matters. A pilot who had read the supplement or heard a briefing based on it already knew that the 190's engine management system handled propeller pitch, fuel mixture, and boost pressure automatically. You did not need to manage 3 separate controls the way you did in most American fighters. You moved one lever. The Kommandogerät did the rest. Kurt Tank designed it that way on purpose. He wanted the 190 to be flyable by pilots with minimal training, a recognition, as early as 1941, that Germany could not afford the long conversion syllabi that complex aircraft demanded. Tank's autobiography mentions this philosophy explicitly. Reduce cockpit workload, reduce training time, get pilots to the front faster. A feature built to help undertrained German replacement pilots survive their first sorties also made it possible for an American with 0 hours in type to get the aircraft off the ground. tank would probably not have appreciated that particular outcome. The Germans knew they were losing the technology race by mid-1944, even when individual weapon systems, the Me-262, the Type 21 U-boat, the Wasserfall surface-to-air missile, represented significant leaps. General Major Dietrich Peltz, commanding Luftwaffe attack forces in the West, told interrogators after the war that German technical superiority in individual designs could not compensate for American superiority in production depth and systematic exploitation. The USSBS interrogation transcript uses his phrasing, "one prototype against 10,000 copies." Peltz meant it as a complaint about American manufacturing volume. He accidentally described something deeper. The United States did not just build more of everything. It built a system for learning from the enemy's best work, integrating what mattered, and discarding the rest, at a speed the German research establishment, fractured by competing ministries and Nazi patronage networks, could never match. Back at Wright Field, the Me-262's turbine blades sat under a metallurgist's microscope. The alloy composition would feed directly into General Electric's own jet engine program within weeks. The pilot on that German grass strip carried a piece of this system in his head, whether he knew it or not. June 19, 1944, 13 days after the Normandy landings. A British recovery team near Cherbourg found a mostly intact Henschel HS 293 glide bomb lying in a hedgerow, its Walter rocket motor still attached, its guidance wiring exposed where shrapnel had peeled back the fuselage skin. They tagged it and photographed it, then requested transport priority to ship it back to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough. The request sat in a logistics queue for 11 days. When the truck finally arrived, the bomb had been stripped for scrap metal by an American engineering battalion, building a temporary bridge 3 fields over. The guidance package, the single most valuable component, the thing that made the HS-293 a precision weapon rather than a dumb bomb with a motor, went into a pile of unidentified German metal and got melted down somewhere in the Cottonton Peninsula. Nobody filed an incident report. The engineering battalion did not know what they had destroyed. The recovery team did not learn what happened until weeks later, when a second request for the item came back marked Asset Not Located. The file at the National Archives contains exactly one annotation in pencil. Disposed of by field unit, date unknown. This kind of loss happened constantly in the summer and fall of 1944. The system described in the previous section, Wright Field's organized pipeline for captured technology, functioned beautifully at the receiving end. The problem lived at the point of contact, in the mud, where combat troops and intelligence teams operated on completely different priorities with almost no coordination. A tank commander advancing through Normandy bocage cared about mines, snipers, and the next hedgerow. A wrecked German aircraft blocking a road junction represented an obstacle to be bulldozed, not a research opportunity to be preserved. Technical intelligence officers from the Air Technical Service Command had authorization to recover enemy equipment, but they traveled behind the front lines, arrived after the combat engineers, and frequently found that the most interesting wreckage had already been cleared or cannibalized. The British had tried to solve this problem earlier in the war. After El Alamein, in late 1942, the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers established dedicated technical intelligence sections attached to forward divisions, specifically tasked with identifying and preserving captured Axis equipment before line units could destroy it. The concept worked in North Africa's open desert, where wrecked panzers sat visible for miles and recovery vehicles could reach them without fighting through urban rubble. It worked less well in Italy's mountains. It barely functioned at all in the claustrophobic terrain of northwestern Europe. Anyway, the American approach through most of 1944 remained reactive rather than systematic at the tactical level. Colonel Harold Watson, who would later run the famous Watson's Whizzers exploitation teams in the final weeks of the war, wrote in a post-action memo that intelligence recovery in the ETO suffers from a fundamental disconnect between the officers who know what to look for and the troops who get there first. Watson's memo, dated January 1945, lists specific losses: 2 partial V-1 airframes scrapped near Liège, a complete Fu-G2-18 radar, set thrown into a canal by retreating Germans, and then ignored by the American unit that secured the canal bridge, components from a Ruhrstahl X-4 air-to-air guided missile found in a railway car and catalogued as miscellaneous ordnance before being shipped to an ammunition dump rather than an intelligence facility. Each of those items represented months of potential analytical advantage, lost. The X-4 missile is worth pausing on. It carried a wire-guided command system that allowed a bomber-destroyer pilot to steer the missile after launch, correcting its flight path toward the target. The Luftwaffe never deployed it operationally in significant numbers, but the engineering concept, wire-guided, operator-corrected, relatively cheap, would show up almost unchanged in post-war American and Soviet anti-tank missile programs. The components sitting in that railway car could have accelerated American guided weapons research by a measurable margin. Instead, they sat in an ammunition dump near Verdun until someone noticed the discrepancy in early 1945 and sent a recovery team. By then, the crates had been exposed to weather for weeks. The wiring harnesses showed corrosion. The gyroscope assembly, the precision component, had suffered moisture damage that made accurate reverse engineering difficult. I think this part of the American war effort gets less criticism than it should. The production miracle and the training pipeline, the strategic bombing campaign, those stories get told and retold. The months of fumbled intelligence recovery in France and the Low Countries, where priceless German technology got bulldozed or rained on or misfiled, rarely make the highlight reel. The system corrected itself by early 1945, when Watson's teams and similar outfits received direct authority and dedicated transport. But the correction came late. And it came late because of something specific about how the Army Air Forces organized themselves in the European theater, a structural choice that put intelligence collection and operational command on parallel tracks that almost never intersected at the squadron level. That structure matters for understanding what happened on the airstrip with the FW-190, because the pilot who climbed into that cockpit did not receive his knowledge of German aircraft through official intelligence channels. He got it somewhere else entirely. Châteaudun Airfield, south of Paris, March 1945. Colonel Harold Watson stood on a cracked concrete taxiway, holding a mimeographed list. 2 pages, single-spaced, stamped secret across the top in red block letters. The list named 15 specific German aircraft types. Next to each type, a quantity. How many examples Army Air Forces headquarters wanted, recovered intact, flyable, delivered to Cherbourg for crating and shipment across the Atlantic. The Me-262 topped the list. Then, the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger, the Arado R-234 jet bomber, the Dornier Do-335 push-pull fighter, a Junkers Ju-388 night fighter with its complete radar installation, the Focke-Wulf Ta-152 high-altitude interceptor, and several more, each one representing a German engineering program that American technical intelligence considered critical to post-war aviation development. Watson had 30 days, maybe less. The Red Army's spring offensive had already crossed the Oder. Every mile the Soviets advanced westward, shrank the territory where these aircraft might still exist, parked in forest clearings, hidden in Autobahn tunnels, sitting in partially destroyed factory dispersal sites across Bavaria, Thuringia, Saxony. Watson's problem broke into 3 distinct pieces, each one ugly. First, find the aircraft before the ground war destroyed them. Second, get qualified pilots to the recovery sites before retreating Germans sabotaged what remained. Third, fly captured enemy aircraft, some of them experimental, some with no surviving technical documentation, across hundreds of miles of contested airspace to a collection point in the Allied rear. The unit Watson assembled for this job numbered fewer than 50 men, pilots, mechanics, intelligence officers, a handful of translators, no dedicated ground transport, no organic security element. They would operate ahead of or alongside advancing American armored spearheads, moving into airfields and factory sites sometimes hours after the last German defenders pulled out. Watson handpicked every pilot. The selection criteria, according to a post-war account compiled by the Air Force's Historical Office, emphasized three qualities: extensive multi-engine and multi-type experience, mechanical aptitude beyond normal pilot training, and, the document uses this phrase, willingness to accept above-average personal risk in non-combat flight operations. That last qualifier is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Non-combat flight operations meant climbing into aircraft you had never flown, built by an enemy whose quality control had collapsed under strategic bombing, fueled with whatever dregs remained in captured storage tanks, and taking off from runways that might or might not have been mined during the German withdrawal. The fact that Watson found volunteers, enthusiastic ones, tells you something about the culture inside the Army Air Force's test and evaluation community by late 1944. These pilots shared a specific psychological profile. They collected type ratings the way other officers collected medals. Watson himself had flown over 40 distinct aircraft types before receiving this assignment. His deputy, Captain Frederick McIntosh, had logged time and captured Italian fighters during the Mediterranean campaign, and reportedly considered the experience the highlight of his war. The men Watson recruited did not view an unfamiliar cockpit as a threat. They viewed it as a puzzle with a throttle. Watson's authority came directly from General Carl Spaatz' headquarters, United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. The order, dated early March 1945, gave Watson's team priority access to any captured airfield in the American zone of advance and authorized him to commandeer transport, fuel, and personnel as needed. On paper, that authority looked absolute. On the ground, it meant arguing with division commanders who had never heard of Watson, did not care about his classified shopping list, and needed the roads he wanted to use for ammunition resupply. Watson's team spent as much time navigating Army bureaucracy as they did navigating German airspace. The deadline tightened daily. Intelligence estimates in March 1945 projected that organized German resistance might collapse within weeks rather than months. That sounds like good news until you consider the implications for aircraft recovery. A rapid German collapse meant chaos, demolition charges on factory floors, retreating troops burning what they could not carry, advancing Allied units securing ground without orders to preserve aviation assets. Watson needed the Wehrmacht to hold together just long enough for his team to reach the interesting hardware before someone torched it. Sources conflict on exactly when Watson's team began active recovery operations. The Air Force Historical Monograph gives a date in late March. Watson's own post-war correspondence suggests his first pilots deployed forward as early as mid-March, riding with armored reconnaissance units and flagging captured airfields for immediate exploitation. Either way, the window between too early to reach the sites and too late to save the aircraft measured days, not weeks. One of the aircraft on Watson's list, the FW-190's long-nosed cousin, the TA-152, existed in fewer than 50 completed examples. Finding one intact required equal parts intelligence work and dumb luck. Watson's team had plenty of the first. They would need even more of the second. April 7th, 1945, 0830 hours. Captain Fred Hillis walked around a Messerschmitt Me-262 parked at the edge of a bombed-out dispersal pen near Lechfeld, Bavaria. Both engines still had their cowlings attached. The tires held air. A thin film of hydraulic fluid wept from the left main gear strut, which meant the seals leaked, but the system still held pressure. Hillis had never sat in a jet aircraft of any nationality. He carried a folded sheet of paper in his flight jacket, a hand-drawn cockpit diagram copied from a technical intelligence supplement, annotated in pencil by someone who had examined a captured example at Wright Field months earlier. The diagram showed throttle positions, fuel cock locations, the critical sequence for lighting the Jumo 004B turbojets without exceeding exhaust gas temperature limits. That sequence mattered enormously. Push the throttles forward too fast during startup, and the turbine blades would overheat. The Jumo 004 had a narrow acceptable temperature band during spool-up, between 300 and 500 degrees Celsius, and overshooting it meant a hot start that could warp the turbine disc beyond repair. German pilots trained on the type received specific instruction on throttle advancement rates. Hillis had a pencil sketch, and about 20 minutes of daylight he felt comfortable spending on the ground. He started both engines on the first attempt. The instrument placards read in German, obviously, but the layout followed a logic that any experienced pilot could parse with minimal study. Airspeed indicator, upper left, altimeter, center. Engine gauges clustered on the right panel. Watson's team had figured out early that German cockpit ergonomics followed consistent conventions across types. Focke-Wulf, Messerschmitt, Heinkel, Dornier all placed primary flight instruments in roughly the same positions, differing mainly in secondary systems and weapons controls. Once you learned the German abbreviations, Geschw for Geschwindigkeit, airspeed, Höhe for altitude, Drehz for Drehzahl, RPM, the cockpit stopped being foreign and became merely unfamiliar. There is a difference. Foreign means incomprehensible. Unfamiliar means you need 10 minutes instead of 2. Watson drilled his pilots on German technical vocabulary before they ever reached a captured airfield. The preparation sessions, held at Châteaudun and later at forward operating locations, covered cockpit placards for every aircraft on the shopping list. Lieutenant Robert Ansbach, one of Watson's recovery pilots, described the process in a post-war interview with the Air Force Oral History Program. Watson had us memorize German cockpit labels the way you'd memorize a phone book: fuel pressure, oil temperature, landing gear position, flap indicator. He'd quiz us at dinner. If you couldn't tell him what Kühlstoff temperature meant, you weren't flying the next day. Kühlstoff temperature, coolant temperature, the kind of gauge reading that kills you if you ignore it in a liquid-cooled engine at full power. The FW-190D9, the long-nosed Dora variant powered by a Junkers Jumo 213 liquid-cooled inline engine rather than the radial BMW 801 of earlier models, presented a different challenge than the jet. The Dora's engine ran hot. Coolant management demanded constant attention during climb and combat maneuvering, and the gauges marking safe operating ranges used color bands that assumed the pilot already knew what Gelb and Rot indicated. Yellow caution, red danger, simple enough if you read German, potentially fatal if you didn't, and mistook a yellow band reading for normal operations, while the engine cooked itself from the inside. Watson's pilots learned to scan German gauges by position and needle behavior rather than reading the labels in real time. A needle sitting in the green arc meant safe. A needle creeping toward a colored band meant reduce power. The specific German word on the placard became secondary to the physical movement of the indicator. This technique, instrument scanning by pattern recognition rather than language comprehension, let American pilots monitor unfamiliar systems at speeds that would have seemed reckless to the Luftwaffe's own training establishment. The Arado R-234 presented yet another problem: twinjet, like the Me-262, but configured as a bomber with a periscopic bomb sight and a brake parachute for landing. The R-234's original design used a jetisonable takeoff trolley and landing skids instead of conventional landing gear, a weight-saving measure that made the aircraft a one-way trip to wherever you landed it. Later production models received a conventional tricycle undercarriage, and Watson's team specifically targeted these later variants. Finding an R-234 with wheels attached narrowed the search considerably. One of Watson's pilots, the records identify him only by rank captain, ferried a recovered R-234 from an airfield near Munich to the collection point at Cherbourg, a flight of roughly 500 miles over Allied-held territory, in an aircraft he had studied for less than an hour before takeoff. The after-action report notes that he landed with the brake parachute deployed because he did not trust the wheel brakes to stop the aircraft on Cherbourg's shortened runway. Smart decision. The German wheel brakes on that particular airframe turned out to have a cracked hydraulic line that would have provided roughly 60% of normal braking force. He didn't know that until after he climbed out. The brake parachute had saved him from a discovery that would have come at 120 knots at the far end of the runway, with no good options remaining. We are flying the future of aviation across France in airplanes held together with hope and stolen gasoline. Watson wrote that line in a field report dated April 22, 1945, and the Air Force Historical Office preserved it without comment. He wasn't exaggerating. By mid-April, Watson's Whizzers had located and begun ferrying German aircraft at a pace that turned Cherbourg's collection point into something resembling an enemy air show. The Me-262 came first, 3 flyable examples pulled from airfields across Bavaria, each one nursed westward by pilots who had learned the type's peculiarities through a combination of crib sheets, captured Luftwaffe maintenance manuals, and sheer nerve. Then, an He-162, the Volksjäger, the People's Fighter, a single-engine jet built from wood and steel because aluminum had become scarce in the Reich's collapsing economy. The He-162 had a nasty reputation even among German pilots. Its BMW 003 turbojet sat on top of the fuselage directly behind the cockpit, which meant an engine failure could send turbine fragments through the back of the pilot's head. The glue bonding its wooden wing panels had proven unreliable in Luftwaffe service, and at least 2 German test pilots died when wings separated during high-speed maneuvering. Watson's men flew it anyway. The Soviets ran a parallel program. Their trophy teams, organized under the NKAP, the People's Commissariat of the Aviation Industry, swept through Eastern German factory sites with similar urgency and considerably more manpower. But the Soviet approach relied on disassembly and rail shipment rather than ferry flights. They crated what they found and sent it east by train. Slower, safer, less dramatic. Watson's pilots chose speed over safety because the calendar demanded it. Every day brought the occupation zones closer to their final boundaries, and aircraft sitting in what would become the Soviet zone after the formal partition needed to move west immediately, or not at all. Captain Kenneth Dahlstrom flew a Dornier Do-335 out of a field in Thuringia, territory earmarked for Soviet occupation, with fuel enough for roughly 90 minutes of flight time. The Do-335, a push-pull twin-engine fighter with one propeller in the nose and another in the tail, produced over 3,000 horsepower combined from its 2 Daimler-Benz 603 engines. It held the distinction of being the fastest piston-engine aircraft Germany ever built. Dahlstrom had studied it for 45 minutes. He took off with the rear engine running rough because he did not have time to troubleshoot it. The sound that aircraft made, 2 12-cylinder inverted V engines, one pulling, one pushing, the exhaust notes slightly out of sync, carried across the field like nothing American ground crews had heard before. A mechanic from Watson's team described it in a letter home as 2 angry cats in a barrel, but fast. The Do-335 reached Dahlstrom's interim landing point, with 11 minutes of fuel remaining. Each ferry flight accumulated risk in ways the pilots couldn't fully track. No 2 captured airframes shared identical maintenance histories. One, Me-262 might have 20 hours on its engines, another might have 90, with the turbine blades approaching the Jumo 004's notoriously short service life of roughly 25 operating hours before mandatory overhaul. Watson's pilots could not check time since overhaul because the German maintenance logs had usually been burned or lost. They checked what they could see: visible cracks, oil leaks, tire condition, control surface movement, and accepted the rest as unknown. Lieutenant Robert Ansbach ferried a Focke-Wulf Ta-152 from a grass strip in northern Germany. The Ta-152, Kurt Tank's masterpiece, the high-altitude interceptor designed to catch B-29s that never came to the European theater, climbed like nothing in the American inventory. Ansbach reported that at 25,000 feet, the aircraft still had power to spare. The Jumo 213E engine, with its MW-50 methanol water injection system, pushing performance numbers that would not appear in American piston fighters for years. He landed at Cherbourg and told Watson the Ta-152 handled better than any fighter he had ever flown, American or otherwise. And then, the ground crews at Cherbourg did something that would have made that Feldwebel from the opening scene physically ill. They painted white stars over the Balkenkreuz on every aircraft. American national insignia applied with brushes and stencils over German crosses, tail swastikas covered with olive drab paint, Luftwaffe data plates left in place but annotated with American inventory numbers written in grease pencil. Germany's most advanced aircraft, the machines that Göring promised would reverse the air war. that Speer's dispersed factories built under impossible conditions, that Gallen's JV-44 flew in the Reich's final weeks, that thousands of slave laborers assembled in underground tunnels, sat in rows on French concrete, wearing the markings of the nation, whose strategic bombing had wrecked the industrial base that created them. 44 German aircraft reached Cherbourg. They crossed the Atlantic on the escort carrier HMS Reaper, a British ship loaned for the purpose, and arrived at Newark, New Jersey in July 1945. The Feldwebel's FW-190 rode in the same hold as the jets that were supposed to save his country. The crate measured 11 feet wide, 14 feet long, and 6 feet tall, stenciled on its side in white paint. FW-19. Oh, foreign equipment. Right Field Materiel Command. Do not drop. Underneath, in smaller letters, someone had added in grease pencil, Jerry's best, handle nice. HMS Reaper rode low in the water, leaving Cherbourg Harbor on June 20, 1945. Her hangar deck and flight deck held the densest concentration of German aviation technology outside the Soviet Union. 44 aircraft, disassembled or folded where wing geometry allowed, packed in crates built by Army engineers using lumber requisitioned from French sawmills. The escort carrier had been designed to carry approximately 20 aircraft in operational configuration. Watson's team crammed in more than double that number by removing wings, folding tail sections, and stacking components with a precision that owed more to furniture movers than aviation mechanics. Every crate carried a manifest listing the aircraft type, its German work number, factory serial number, and a handwritten condition assessment. Flyable. Flyable with repairs. Structural damage. Engines intact. Complete wreck. Instrumentation only. The crossing took 9 days. Reaper docked at Newark on July 19, 1945. Longshoremen unloaded the crates onto flatbed trucks for the rail transfer to Wright Field. A photographer from the Army Signal Corps shot 16 frames of the unloading. Those photographs survive in the National Archives, Record Group 342. In frame 11, 2 dock workers in civilian clothes stand next to an uncrated Me-262 fuselage, cigarettes in their mouths, one of them resting his hand on the leading edge of the wing root. The jet that Luftwaffe pilots called Die Schwalbe, the Swallow, sat on a Newark dock between a coffee warehouse and a shipping office, 30 feet from the Hudson River, surrounded by men who had no idea what they touched. Wright Field received the first shipments in late July. Building 45, a cavernous test hangar on the South Complex, became the primary examination facility. The Air Technical Service Command assigned rotating teams of engineers, metallurgists, and aerodynamicists to each aircraft type. Their job: complete technical exploitation, strip every system to its components, measure tolerances, analyze alloy compositions, bench test instruments, run the engines on dynamometers until they failed, then cut the failed parts open to study the fracture patterns. The Me-262's Jumo 004 turbojets came apart first. American engineers already knew the basic architecture from earlier intelligence reports, but having complete engines on the bench revealed details that photographs and prisoner interrogations had missed. The turbine blades used a hollow core design for weight reduction. Clever, but the manufacturing tolerances varied wildly between individual blades. Some blades met specification. Others fell outside acceptable limits by margins that would have grounded the engine in American service. The metallurgists found the explanation in the alloy itself: Germany's chronic shortage of nickel and chromium, strategic metals consumed by the war economy faster than neutral suppliers could deliver them, forced Junkers to substitute inferior alloys in late production engines. The turbine blades looked right, they measured right. They failed early because the metal itself lacked the heat resistance that the design required. General Electric's engineers at their West Lynn, Massachusetts plant received Wright Field's metallurgical reports within weeks. The hollow blade concept influenced GE's own J-33 engine development. The alloy failures did not. America had nickel, chromium, cobalt, molybdenum, tungsten. Every refractory metal that German metallurgists spent the last 2 years of the war desperately trying to replace with substitutes. The design ideas transferred. The material constraints did not. That gap between German ingenuity and German industrial capacity defined what Wright Field's engineers found in aircraft after aircraft. The Do-335's contra-rotating propeller system represented advanced engineering by any measure. The execution relied on a gearbox that American inspectors rated as adequate under ideal conditions, probable failure point under sustained combat loading. The Ta-152's MW-50 injection system boosted engine power by nearly 400 horsepower at altitude. The plumbing leaked. The R-234's bomb-aiming periscope offered a targeting solution that American engineers called elegant. The optical glass contained impurities that degraded image quality below 15,000 feet. Every German aircraft at Wright Field told the same story twice. First telling, German engineers solved problems that American engineers had not yet attempted. Second telling, German factories built those solutions with materials and quality control that American factories had surpassed by 1943. A Wright Field evaluation summary dated September 1945, declassified in 1978, contains a sentence that lands like a closing argument. The examined aircraft demonstrate that German aeronautical engineering operated at a level fully comparable to current U.S. development programs. The examined aircraft also demonstrate that German production capability operated at a level approximately 36 months behind current U.S. standards. Comparable ideas. Inferior execution. That is what happens when your engineering culture runs 3 years ahead of the industrial base keeping it alive, and your enemy's industrial base runs 3 years ahead of everything. The Feldwebel's FW-190 sat in Building 45 through the autumn of 1945. Its BMW 801 radial yielded no secrets that Wright Field didn't already possess. Its airframe construction matched known specifications. Its radio equipment used vacuum tubes that American manufacturers had stopped producing in 1943 because better designs existed. It had been, in the end, an ordinary airplane, competent, well made by the standards of a nation running out of everything except skill. The nation that took it had skill and everything else, 44 aircraft. That number, Watson's final tally at Cherbourg, represented less than 0.1% of the roughly 40,000 military aircraft Germany produced between 1939 and 1945, a rounding error in the ledger of total war. But those 44 machines carried something that 40,000 could not: a future. Within 18 months of arriving at Wright Field, data extracted from Watson's Hall fed directly into 6 separate American development programs. The swept-wing research embodied in the Me-262's wing planform, a modest 18.5 degrees of sweep at the leading edge, adopted by Messerschmitt primarily to solve a center of gravity problem rather than to exploit transonic aerodynamics, merged with captured German wind tunnel data from the Aerodynamische Versuchsanstalt at Göttingen to reshape what North American aviation did with the F-86 Sabre. The original F-86 design used a straight wing. After North Americans' engineers reviewed the German swept-wing research that Wright Field distributed in late 1945, they redesigned the entire aircraft around a 35-degree swept wing. The F-86 that flew over Korea in 1950, the fighter that broke Soviet-built MiG-15s over the Yalu River at a kill ratio that American pilots maintained above 7-1, descended in a direct engineering line from data that Watson's team pulled out of collapsing Germany at gunpoint. The hollow turbine blade concept from the Jumo 004 appeared, refined and properly alloyed, in General Electric's J-47 engine, the power plant that drove the B-47 Stratojet, America's first swept-wing strategic nuclear bomber. The ramjet research notes recovered from BMW's Spandau facility contributed to early American missile propulsion studies. The R-234's brake parachute system, the same system that saved an unnamed captain's life on a short runway at Cherbourg, became standard equipment on American high-performance jets through the 1950s and 60s. German engineers designed these things to win a war they had already lost. American engineers took the designs, matched them to an industrial base that could actually build them to specification, and turned the result into the architecture of Cold War air superiority. a Wright Field engineer named Donald Putt, he held the rank of brigadier general by 1951, told an Air Force Association symposium that Watson's captured aircraft program saved American aviation development between 3 and 5 years of independent research. The symposium transcript, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base, records applause after that line. Putt had been one of the officers who authorized Watson's mission in the first place. He knew what he measured. 7 of Watson's ferry pilots received commendation letters. The records at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, partially damaged in the 1973 fire that destroyed roughly 80% of Army personnel files from 1912 to 1964, contain fragments of 3 commendations. Sources conflict on whether additional awards followed through separate channels. Colonel Harold Watson himself received the Legion of Merit for the operation. He stayed in the Air Force after the war, rose to Major General, commanded test facilities, retired in 1966. Robert Anspach left the service in 1946 and flew commercial aviation for TWA until his death in 1982. Kenneth Dahlstrom, the man who flew the Do-335 out of Soviet-designated territory with 90 minutes of fuel, returned to civilian life in Minnesota and ran a hardware store. He rarely discussed the war. Captain Fred Hillis, who lit those Jumo 004 engines on his first attempt at Lechfeld, stayed in the Air Force through Korea. The personnel file doesn't say whether he ever flew jets operationally. 2 of Watson's Whizzers died in the years immediately following the war in flight test accidents, unrelated to captured German equipment. Routine hazards of experimental aviation, in an era when test pilots died at a rate that would shut down any modern program overnight. 20 years after Watson's team painted American stars over German crosses, an F-4 Phantom carrying 2 General Electric J-79 turbojets, engines whose lineage traced through the J-47, through the J-33, back to a bench at Wright Field, where American metallurgists cut open a Jumo 004 turbine blade and said, "We can do this better," rolled onto a catapult at Yankee Station in the Tonkin Gulf. The pilot, a lieutenant commander whose name the operational records preserve only as a side notation on a mission schedule, pushed his throttles forward and felt 17,000 pounds of thrust press him into the ejection seat. Below him, the carrier's deck crew cleared the catapult track. The steam gauge read pressure. The holdback fitting strained. He saluted the catapult officer. The shuttle fired. The Phantom accelerated from 0 to 160 knots in 2.5 seconds, cleared the bow, and climbed into the gray air over the South China Sea, trailing 2 thin lines of exhaust that dissolved behind him like contrails from a war nobody on that flight deck had fought.